Okay, well, it's time to go, and out of respect for everybody's time, I'd like to go ahead and kick off the program. So hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, the L&D Measurement Journey, Creating a Chain of Evidence for Learners' Impact. I'd like to start by introducing myself. My name is David Kiesel, and I'm the Director of Sales and Marketing for Riptide Software's Learning Division, and I will be your moderator for today's program. Some quick housekeeping notes before we get started. All participants are on mute. We do want to hear from you during the session. Please use the question feature on the GoToWebinar control panel to post your question. We have saved time at the end of the webinar to answer questions in the allotted time. If we cannot answer your question live, we will respond to you via email, so please post any and all questions. In addition to the question feature, there's also the chat feature of the control panel, and feel free to post any comments or additional feedback you'd like to share. So the last housekeeping note, this webinar will be recorded. You will receive a follow-up email within 48 hours with a link to the recording, access to the slide deck, and links to a few additional tools and resources you will learn about during the webinar. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. With us today, we have Kevin Yates. Kevin is the creator of the Courage Model and an expert advisor for using measurement, evaluation, and analytics to show learning and development's impact on goals and performance. Also with us today is our own Nick Washburn, the Learning Division Director for Riptide Software. Nick is the visionary and product owner for Riptide Elements Learning Technologies. Nick is also a member of the work group that created the Experience API, or XAPI, and he continues to work and be involved in research and development for XAPI and LRS strategies for today's learning enterprise. So let's get started. We're going to kick off today's program with a few brief slides to level set exactly what we mean when we use terms like data, measurement, and learning analytics. Nick, please kick us off.
Thank you, David. So it's very common in the world today in adapting customers with activity stream technology, adapting to them. What do you know about activity stream technology? We have a general awareness that the training function is late coming to the high-tech table, but the fact is that we're here and we can step right into using some of these technology advancements. Next, please. So big data, Internet of Things, machine learning, what does it all mean? Big data can provide data visualization and analytics, of course, but it is more than that. And how can big data apply to training? Next, please. Outside of the learning function, the rest of the business is quantifying their existence with data. Twitter, Facebook, financial companies, social apps, and more use the concept of activity streams as core to their user experience. And for all of us in attendance today, the learner is our customer. Next, please. What is XAPI? So the Experience API is it's an e-learning reporting specification that allows learning content and learning systems to speak to each other in a manner that tracks and records all types of learning experience, anything digital. Learning experiences are recorded in a learning record store, and that's essentially a database. Next, please. XAPI is activity stream technology. So Riptide's part of the work group that created XAPI, and when we were working, we were purposefully standing on the shoulders of the work being done in activity stream technology. Notice the continuous query ability and the new insights. You can even adapt in real time using these big data techniques, and it's available today. Next, please. This is an interface that we put on our learning record store. And if you look towards the upper left, you'll see that we have the ability to query all the data. We can create custom visualizations on any kinds of data points, and we'll get into more of that later. And we can build visualizations and dashboards. Next, please. And the dashboards can be distributed as live data feeds into what's going on to many different audiences by embedding as web pages or exporting as static reports. Next, please. This is a screenshot of an admin portal that's being informed by our LRS. You can see the overall engagement metrics just showing basic completions. It's probably just very similar to what you have in your views. Next, please. And you can get group and individual view of completion and status and how they're doing with courses, and you can do some filtering of this information. Next, please. You can even ask for a bit more course detail, like what was the user's score and the date of their certification. Next, please. So the Analytics tab view is built using that reporting interface that I was showing in a few screens before, and is distributing the dashboard here as a live data feed. This administrator, he wanted to know the average score, average time spent per page, to see if the users are just, fast clicking through the course. And there's those types of data insights is what you can build here. Next, please. So in our travels, many organizations are beginning to see an immediate use for an LRS because it can help gain a holistic view of what's going on in the entire learning ecosystem and can make a direct correlation or chain of evidence about how specific training material affects performance. Practically speaking right now, you could add better reporting to digital learning activity using the simple A through D approach. Very often we work with a crawl, walk, run approach. You can start here with crawl by simply adding XAPI reporting to something. And you can continue to iterate through A, B, C, and D, working towards the architecture that you want to be at. So that's it for level setting. And with that, I will turn you over to the very capable hands of Kevin Yates. Kevin?
Thank you, Nick. I am so excited to be having this discussion today with all of you. No doubt these are really exciting times for learning and development. And where I am most excited is when I hear talk about the learning ecosystem. And I am also excited when I think about how XAPI data gives us the ability to tell our story and use data as evidence for learning and development's impact. With XAPI data, we have access to evidence that we've not seen before. And in our learning and development journey, the good news is that there's data for each step along the way. Starting with goals and what the organization wants to achieve, there's data that shows learning and development's impact. And then for performance, where we're thinking about the way people execute their day-to-day work, there's data that shows how people's performance is impacting goals. And then for knowledge, we're looking at the brain power people have to perform in a way that achieves goals. There's data that shows training's impact on learning outcomes, and at the same time, there's data that shows that there may be some knowledge gaps. And then the last step along the way in the journey, for results, where we're looking at immediate outcomes from training, there's data that shows training's effectiveness, and there's data that also helps us forecast performance impact. So I'm curious, I know that there are a lot of you that have joined us today for this discussion, and you're already on the journey, or maybe you're just starting the journey. So we're going to ask you to use the chat feature and answer the question, where are you in your organization's data and measurement journey? Are you using data to show learning development's impact on goals? Are you using measurement and data to show training's impact on performance? Use the chat window and just share where you are, and we'll take a look at what's coming in and just get some feedback from you. We want this to be a two-way discussion. So again, if you'll just use the chat window and share where you are in the journey, we'll take a look at what's coming in. And Nick or Christy, I believe that you may be able to see what's coming in. I can't see it here, but maybe if you could just read off a couple of what people are sharing.
I think people are hesitant to inform us in the fact that we might be capturing the data, so we're not seeing a lot of chats at this time, Kevin.
No worries at all. Well, hopefully what we'll all get from the time that we'll spend together is just a little bit more knowledge on what that journey looks like. No worries. So let's take a look at an idea about data as evidence. Next slide, please. So in the work that I do with clients, and the guiding principle that has literally transformed what I believe about the work we do as learning development professionals, I've embraced the idea that we don't have to wish, hope, or believe learning and development makes an impact. we have the data to prove it. You know, other functions in the organization, marketing, operations, finance, they're already using data for decision making and for insights and for measuring performance. I'm excited that learning development has now reached a point where we are beginning to make data-driven decisions and use data for our strategies and insights on learning development's efficiency, effectiveness, and outcomes. I'm just really excited that we are starting to use data to show our impact on goals. So let's take a look at how we use data to do that. When we think about goals, there are three questions we can ask. What is the goal? Or said another way, what does the organization want to achieve? What are the desired results? So what are the expected outcomes for achieving the goals? And then we can ask, who are the stakeholders? Or said another way, who or what else other than learning and development has a role in achieving a goal? So let's take a closer look at these ideas. When we focus on organization goals first, and when we have conversations that are focused on what the organization wants to achieve, before having any discussion about training, we are setting ourselves up to be strategically in line with goals. And this is a very different kind of discussion than the ones we've historically had. The ones that we've had sound very much like order taking. You know, someone from the organization will come to us and say, I need some training. And it kind of sounds like saying, you know, I'll take 2 classroom programs, 1 e-learning, a side order of web-based training, and a Diet Coke to go. It sounds just like that kind of order taking. But when we focus on goals first and have a conversation about what the organization wants to achieve, we're focusing on how our learning solutions will help the organization be successful. And quantifying or even qualifying the goal gives us the measure that drives the data we'll use to evaluate learning and development's impact. So with the examples that you have here, or that you see here, we have quantified the desired outcomes for each goal, and in those goals we'll guide the metrics that we use for our data. So we'll reduce errors by 20%, or improve customer satisfaction by 2 points, and so on. So I'd like to try to have a conversation. Again, hopefully you'll feel comfortable in joining. If not, no worries. But if you use the chat feature to share what a goal in your organization looks like, what goals do you have that are supported by learning and development? Just use the chat window to share your thoughts. And again, if you're comfortable sharing, great. If not, no worries. We just want to try to engage and have a two-way conversation here. So again, Dave and Christy, if you see some items coming in, let me know.
Reducing custom.
Yeah, hey, we do have a few. And what we learned is, and you know what, this is a GoToWebinar UX opportunity. You know, there's the question and the chat. So actually, the question is where a lot of people are posing, which is actually fine. So
Reducing customer.
No worries.
yeah, reducing customer churn is a key one that came up, and that's obviously big.
Required training annually
Yeah,
of IT employees against state and local regulations.
Say it a little louder, please.
Yeah. Yeah.
What else do you got?
We have some regulatory stuff in and around regulatory and regulatory requirements are some key goals that are being identified, which makes a ton of sense.
Yep. All right. Sounds like we got some good stuff coming in, and it also sounds like the good news for me is that we're hearing our learning and development professionals be able to talk about what the organization goals are. So it sounds as though you guys are already connected and aligned, and that's a perfect segue. Even with knowing what the goal is, we know that achieving goals is team sport. So let's look at what I mean by that. If you'll just go back one slide, Dave. All right. Oh, I'm sorry. Go forward. I apologize. We're good. All right. So, contrary to popular belief, training is not a silver bullet. We don't have a magic bag of tricks that will solve every problem in the organization. We don't own success for reaching a goal. We share it. So the data we use to show learning and development's impact comes from agreement amongst all stakeholders for the success they own, and most important, what they don't own. And this is what we call isolating the impact of training. And this idea comes from my mentors, Jack and Patty Phillips at the ROI Institute. So in this example, there's an organization goal to reduce errors by 20%. Training owns 3% of that goal, not 100%. So the data we collect about that goal will reflect the share of success that comes from training and development. But we have to be aligned with the organization in order to do that. And Nick is going to talk a little bit more about alignment. Nick?
Sure, thanks. Next, please. So if Kevin were a client of ours, we would work from an engineering standpoint to align ourselves with him. We can understand that he might have multiple initiatives going on, so we want to be very specific about the results we can create for him. In our work, and what I want to do when the baton gets passed to me here is I want to make sure I just stick to practical application and giving some real examples. So our customers are the subject matter experts, instructional designers, learning technology providers, learning product developers, learning content providers. Our products represent an enabling technology that helps them to accomplish goals. So it's not really the purpose of the presentation to go in depth about Riptide's engineering process, but each step in our process usually involves producing artifacts or showing results or why we did something. Next, please. In this case study, we provided a sales training experience and learning data reporting for a major airline services company. The goal of the program was simple. It was to provide a 0.17 or 17-cent euro increase in spend per head. So the sales training had to increase the sales. The program was able to show at the end a 35-cent euro increase, so it nearly doubled. And the learning experience included complex branching scenarios that were based on real stories from the field. The training was gamified with a portal that was showing training points that could be earned. The scenarios had multiple outcomes, and only one path would produce the highest score. So the learners were encouraged to compete for the highest possible training points available. Next, please. Here's a little bit about what that looked like. The entire program had to work on mobile or PC, and you can see on the right an example of the sales scenarios. Learners were also receiving training points for collaborating socially. Their key performance indicators were displayed as goals and actuals, so we were updating the portals with individual sales performance from the sales system as well. And the double mountain range graphic on the left, that's showing the goals and the actuals. So there's a real world example, and I'll pass it back to Kevin Yates.
Thank you, sir. So, a few years ago, I really had a transformation about who I am and what I do as a learning and development professional. And when I realized at the end of the day that the work that I do is really focused on changing people's performance. So in thinking about performance, there are three questions I like to ask. The first one being, what are the critical behaviors that drive the goal, or what is it that people need to do day to day in work to achieve goals? The other question to ask is, are the behaviors specific and observable? So rather than saying people need to know or people need to understand, I'm thinking about a specific description of a skill or behavior. Then the last question, can we quantify the occurrence, quality, and accuracy of that specific skill or behavior? And this is where we define the success criteria for performance, and most important, is the source for the metrics that we'll use for our data that measures performance impact. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Next slide, please. These are examples of specific behaviors. So here we see that the behaviors are described as administer dosage, process orders, and solve customer calls, and evacuate passengers. This doesn't tell the whole story about the behavior, and it doesn't give us data to measure results. So let's see what it looks like when we quantify the occurrences, the quality, and the accuracy. Next slide, please. When we quantify the behavior, we source the metrics we use for the data that tells the story about learning and development impact on performance. So here we said that in order to reach the goal, staff have to administer dosages correctly 100% of the time to avoid fatalities. We said that orders need to be processed with no errors 98% of the time, and customers who call to report connectivity issues should have those issues resolved without having to be transferred to another technician. And then last, within 10 minutes, all passengers should be executed. So what we have here is the source of the data that we use to measure the accuracy and the occurrence of the behavior of the performance. So these are behavior-based descriptions with quantified measures that drive our data collection strategy. Let's take a look at what I mean about that. When we define the performance requirements to achieve goals and do it with quantified measures for what it takes to achieve the goal, we're positioning our measurement strategy for the data we'll use to show learning development's impact, and we're also ensuring that our learning solutions are focused on measurable outcomes. So let's have another conversation, and I think we got it down pat now, Dave and Christy. I'm interested to hear from you, our audience, our participants. We want to keep the conversation going. What examples can you share for performance requirements to achieve goals in your organization? Use the chat window and let's see how you are describing performance requirements in your organization. And just keep in mind, again, that one of the reasons that we quantify the occurrences and we identify the accuracy, and those are the metrics that are ultimately going to source the data that we use to determine the impact of learning development on behavior performance. So I'm hoping that you guys are sharing some examples that you have of how you are describing performance that helps the organization reach goals. Dave and Christy, do we have some feedback coming in?
Yeah, we do, Kevin. One of them is churn. The other is reduce the initial training for new engineers from 6 weeks to 2 weeks. Another is employee turnover. So we have a lot of good answers coming in for performance requirements.
Awesome. Awesome. How about one more? I'm just curious. Give me one more.
Another one is projects delivered on time.
Oh, that's a good one.
Got it. Got it. Great. So it sounds as though, based on what you and Dave are saying, we're getting some good responses again. And it's also, again, encouraging to hear that you are connected with what the organization needs and that you are able to describe those performance requirements. That's great. So let's take a look at what the data looks like that gives us insight into how people are performing based on their learning experience. So Nick, can you show some examples of data that shows impact on performance?
Sure, yes, thank you. So let's talk about performance and performance outcomes. This dashboard is showing the impact of training and the ability to perform to a certain standard. And you should be able to get predictive in the way that the learner is actually performing during the training. And the top bar is indicating and showing in red that when performing the training simulation, the learner is taking too long to do something. And on the right, you can gain some details into where that delay might be happening, like what was going on in the activity stream. If you click next, please. In this example, the learner has to go through several hours and modes of training, and this is it's highly technical training. It's information assurance or cybersecurity type training course, and each person's progress is being tracked with an LRS and then displayed in a badging achievements dashboard. And when the learner has filled all the badges, they're ready to certify. The learning activity stream data collected can help the instructional designers to fine-tune what it takes to earn a badge. As the data helps them map to the learning objectives around badges, they can do this based on the information they gain from the certification process and also how the users are performing at their job after the certification, and they can make easy adjustments to what it takes to certify. Next, please. So what kinds of data are we talking about when we're talking about the type of data that we're catching? So how do we populate these data visualizations and reports? What are the kinds of data? What does it look like? We recently released an XAPI Inspector as a Chrome plugin, And here you see the type of data is partly human readable and in context showing you how I interact with the video on the left. I usually show this as a live demonstration, but you can see that I seek the video at a certain time in the timeline, and then I pause the video at a certain time in a timeline. Next, please. If I'm interacting with a sales simulation, you can see that I've answered one of the questions, and it's weighted because I will have a score at the end. So I answered a scaled question, and that was my response. And you can kind of, I'm pointing with a little arrow so you can kind of see a little bit that the XAPI data is actually semi-human readable. And next, please. So now that I've completed my attempt and I have a score of 16, which is not considered a passing score, so I'm encouraged to try again on the right. If this was a real sales call, it would not have been a very good outcome. We can know this, and all this data in the LRS can now be queried specifically to understand what is going on with the learners. Again, the XAPI Inspector is available for a free download, and one of the ways you might use it is you might copy and paste XAPI from something that you think works to help you to gain similar insights and repurpose it for your own use. But what this data does is it gives you insights into what to expect when people are performing on the job, right? That's what this example is trying to show. So I'm going to give it back to Kevin now. Thank you.
So that is absolutely awesome, Nick. Thank you so much for that. And I just get really, really excited when I see this kind of data because it gives me insight into evidence that I've not had before the invent of XAPI technology. So, Dave, I'd be pretty curious to hear what our audience thinks about this.
No, absolutely. And I prepared a poll question, so if everybody's okay, and it's probably a nice breaking point, get the fingers moving. We have posted a poll. If everybody could take the next 15 to 20 seconds, we'd like to collect everybody's input.
And while everyone is giving us their feedback, again, one of the things for me that is particularly exciting in the work that I do day to day, I do work with clients, and I'm always looking for ways in which I can add value to the learning development story that talks about how learning development impacts performance and goals. And I'm looking for data that I can use as evidence to do that. So I'm hoping that what you see here is that with XAPI data, we can tell a very different kind of story than that which we've not been able to tell in the past. So, hey, David, how's it looking? Are we getting some answers coming in?
We do. I think we're going to stop it and go ahead and share the results with the group.
Yeah, so about 54% of people said yes, 7% of the attendees said no, and 39% still said they're not sure. Got it.
Well, certainly, those of you that aren't sure, we got a little bit further to go in the journey here today, so maybe you'll get some more information that will help you in that decision. For those of you that are already using learning record stores and XAPI data, awesome. And then for those that are not, maybe we'll change your minds. That certainly helps stuff. So I know it's cliche, but knowledge really is power. And the difference between what people know and what they need to know could be the difference between achieving a goal or not. So when we think about the knowledge power that comes from training and development, there's three questions that I like to ask. The first one is, did training produce new knowledge? Do people really acquire a new level of thinking that will influence their behavior? The second question I like to ask is, do people have the required knowledge to meet performance expectations? Or said another way, did training result in a learning transformation that will ultimately influence the way they perform in their day-to-day work? And then the last question that I'm thinking about is whether or not there are any knowledge gaps. So, really thinking about what's the difference between the knowledge power people have and what they need to have in order to perform in a way that helps the organization achieve goals. So let's talk about that knowledge gap a little bit more. The relationship between knowledge, performance, and goals are undeniably linked to each other. So when you think about it, knowledge drives performance and performance drives goals. So if you'll just go back again, Dave, sorry about that. Yep. When we think about learning and development's impact on knowledge, we can say that it strengthens knowledge where someone may already be strong. It helps people change performance where improvement may be needed. And we can say that training and development helps people acquire new knowledge where it didn't exist. And that would be an example of training and development filling a knowledge gap. So I want to talk a little bit more about knowledge gaps. So we saw earlier that training is not a silver bullet. We talked about isolating the impact, and we saw the role that other functions of the business have in achieving a goal. There are multiple factors that influence achieving a goal. At the same time, there are instances where knowledge gaps are threatening an organization's ability to achieve goals. So it's very helpful to see where an organization is strong in its knowledge power and where there are gaps. So let's take a look at the data that shows people's knowledge. Nick, can you show us a few examples of data that shows people's knowledge?
Sure, thank you. Next screen, please. This is an admin interface that we're providing for the University of Southern California. On the left are the types of data that we're collecting from pre- and post assessments. And USC has asked for the ability to look up the results from specific learners. So what they're doing is they're looking at the pre- and post-test results and seeing and trying to discern where the knowledge gaps are in this administrative interface. We've given them a bunch of different types of data points like this, but this is just one where I think it's specifically looking pre and post, what are the gaps? Or what gaps were filled, I think is essentially what they're trying to do. Next, please. With our inline software training product, we train users directly on the software. And this is a place where you start to, the data and the training itself starts to really expose and understand this concept of knowledge gaps. Next, please. So we have multiple clients using this approach, and it works on really complex software interfaces. But we put together a simple demo, and this is a screenshot from it. We're teaching some simple tasks in WordPress. And here I'm learning how to change a theme. And you can see down the lower right where it's keeping track of where I'm at in the lesson, because literally I'm using the software normally right now. This isn't a simulation. If the training's happening directly in the software application, so I can do what I want while I'm using this application. Next, please. So once I've taught the user the steps to do something, you can now verify with a competency-based assessment. So the application now listens for the learner to complete the steps of changing a theme. And so now I say OK, and it's just waiting for me to do it and tracking my normal use of the software. Next, please. In the lower right, you can see as I complete, the steps are checked off, and I can use the software normally here, and I might wander around a bit and take more time, and all that's being captured as well to help evaluate the training. So we can see where this approach may also help to improve the software itself. Where you might be listening for people to do certain things and you're understanding and seeing them struggling. Next, please. This graph is showing the data around a question pool, so it's validating assessments. And you can see the anomalies where you might want to look closer at some of the actual questions. There's a big dip there just slightly to the right of the center where almost nobody can get that question right. And the gap might not be in knowledge, it might be in the questions, or it might be in the training. So we also capture the questions themselves so they can be easily looked up in the Learning Record Store. Next, please. There's other types of engagement that you can gain as well. And here you see where you can show average time spent per activity and launch versus completion. So there's engagement and other metrics that you can also add to trying to understand where the knowledge gaps are and adjust and sustain your training program. With that, I'll give it back to Kevin. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. So team, here's what we've seen. Nick has shown us data that shows learning and development's impact on goals. And then he showed us data that shows learning and development's impact on performance. What we just saw was data that shows learning's impact on knowledge. And so in that journey, if you remember that map that we started with, that last point along the way was data for results. And so the data we collect about our learning solutions performance tells us about efficiency and effectiveness. We can also collect data that forecasts training's impact on performance with questions like, will training change performance? How much and how often? And what is the overall performance of the learning solution itself? I like to use post-learning evaluations and surveys as a way to forecast changes in performance. So let's take a look at some of the questions that I like to use. So these questions predict or forecast a learning solution's impact on performance by asking questions like how much of what was learned will be used and how often, and the estimated impact on performance. And asking questions like how much is predicted to be used and how often sets us up very nicely, if you recall, when we were creating those performance statements where we were quantifying measures. That gives us a nice tie-in right back to that. So these questions, in essence, become a forecasting tool, and while they are estimates, the data is part of the chain of evidence that tells learning and development story. So let's see some examples of using surveys to answer questions about training's performance. Nick, what can you show us?
Thank you, Kevin. So I know that your approach to surveying is proven. So your approach and your survey technique is proven, and it's proven to be predictive. And we can support that type of strategy with our technology. We can definitely support the strategies that that you're discussing here and more. And this is just an example of, in the earlier example of the sales training for the airlines, where they utilize the survey as well. Next screen. If we go back to the example of USC, they're also using survey data and some of the activity stream data to create different learner profiles and send learners through different paths in their certification training process that they're using. So this is an example of a dashboard where they're creating learner profiles and they're A/B testing content using this method, and they're collecting data around that and sort of updating and adapting to the data that they're getting. And then watching the results as they adjust and the users go through it. Next screen, please. This is another example of how you can predict performance from the training environment. So in this training, the users are able to do cross-training. So it's a role-based delivery of a bunch of different types of content, and users are able to cross-train into other jobs. And you can see that on the left, I'm logged in as my role, and it tells me where I'm at in my certification, but it also shows other roles that I've certified at. And if you've mastered another job here, it should indicate that I'm going to be able to perform that job role as well, and it can give some good examples of predicting and showing the results of the training there, making it available. Next screen, please. I think one of the things just to share here as we're kind of wrapping this up, it was really interesting during this collaboration with you that our process parallels how an industry professional like Kevin Yates works and thinks. You know, it's best practice really in engineering, I guess, but this is how we approach our XAPI work in L&D. And you can start small in analysis and design, you get something, report, collect data, report and evaluate, and then iterate through the steps again. And it was just interesting to me that the way we think from an engineering standpoint and from your standpoint really did we really do parallel. What do you say? What say you, Kevin?
well, thanks, Nick. And I'll just say it's affirming, of course, to hear that you're seeing the parallel between my approach, and not only my approach, the approach that other learning development professionals are taking as well. But it's just good to see that a best practice is a best practice is a best practice and can be applied across industries and across methods. So I do believe that it's interesting that even before we had this collaboration with one another, this process that I use is already in place, and then you saw where it's being used as well. So I think that's pretty awesome.
Right.
Yeah. Well, you know, Nick, I think that today our conversation has really been about creating a chain of evidence that shows impact for learning and development. And I think that you've done a great job at showing us along the way how there's data for each one of those steps. And for each step in the learning measurement journey, again, we saw where there's data to help tell that story. So with the first step, there's data for goals that shows us how learning and development helps the organization be successful. And we talked about isolating and how achieving goals is a team sport. And then with the next step, there's data for impact on performance. And that shows us how learning and development is impacting people's behavior and skill and how they're executing day to day. And so you show us how there's data that gives us insight and evidence for that. And then the next step was showing us data for knowledge. And then that step shows us the learning outcomes, or it's showing us whether or not people know what they need to know in order to perform the way they need to perform to reach those goals. And then that last step along the way was just where we have a way in which we can use data to measure training results. And we saw an example of how I'd like to use data to forecast impact on performance. So the good news, everybody, is that we do have the data and we do have the evidence. And I have a very personal philosophy, guiding principle about that I'd like to share with you. Next slide, please. So for me, this says it all. The greatest opportunity, I believe, for learning and development lays in our commitment to producing fact-based evidence for our value and our role in helping organizations achieve goals. And I'm encouraged that you have joined this discussion today, and I believe it says that we're really beginning to make measurable results for learning and development a priority. So I am encouraged that you're here, and I'm certainly hoping that the conversation that Nick and I have had with you has been one that is helpful, and I really am hoping that there's at least one thing that you can take away from today. So I'm just going to turn it back over to you, Dave.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate it. And we're a little ahead on schedule, but I'm sure we're not going to get a lot of complaints as everybody's busy. But just a couple to recap. We're going to address a couple of questions here. But we also are going to post a survey in the chat window. And we would, this wouldn't be a really good L&D program if we didn't have a survey, right? And we are data-driven, so we do want to collect data and understand where the experts in the industry are in their journey and their thought process. And then, obviously, if there's anything you heard today that you're intrigued or that you want to talk to Kevin about, or the folks here at Riptide, by all means contact us. And Kevin is offering a promo for all attendees for a free hour of consulting, so please take advantage of that if you have that need. And so with that, Kevin and Nick, we're going to take a couple of questions. And so I'm going to.
Oh, great! We have some people asking questions. Excellent.
We do. So the first one was from Michael, and this is going to be towards you, Nick. Is will the XAPI Inspector be receiving updates?
Yes. So the XAPI Inspector source code is at our Git repository at tryxapi.com, and if you click there, you can add some comments or email me directly if you find something wrong with it. But really, if you open it up when you're just surfing around the internet, it's going to be throwing a bunch of null statements at you. It's really for something that claims to be reporting XAPI, and then it will show you exactly that XAPI that it's reporting, and that's where it becomes useful because you can validate your statements with it. You can run through an entire activity that you really like the XAPI format of and copy and paste it and repurpose it for yourself. It's kind of a developer tool, but I do show it because you can show things coming live into the XAPI Inspector, and you can sort of track, even if you don't know how to read the code, what's going on. Is that a good answer?
Yeah, absolutely. So I got one here for you, Kevin. This is from Scott. And Scott, if I butcher this or the context is not right, just kind of re-chat a question to clarify. But Kevin, the question is, why don't L&D measure more of their learning projects?
That's a great question, and I have a few theories about that. And the top one that comes to mind is that it's almost like a unicorn effect, right? So historically, we've not provided data, we've not provided metrics, we've not provided evidence. So I'm not so sure that the leaders, the senior leaders in the organizations where we work, believe it's possible. So if they don't believe it's possible, they're not going to ask for it. So I think that on some levels, we have to push and we have to educate and we have to show senior leaders and executives in the business and the organizations that we can indeed produce data and fact-based evidence that shows the impact of learning development on goals and people's performance. But again, to answer Scott's question, on some levels, I don't believe that, or rather, I believe that more people aren't asking for it because they don't know that we can do it. I hope that answer makes sense.
I think if I could add a little bit to that too, I think there's a little bit of, you know, maybe it's been tried in the past and it was too difficult and costly and there really wasn't a clear path. It might not be out of the desire, it might be out of past failures too, you know. And the old SCORM specification not really producing too much. There's a lot kind of that goes into that answer, but that was a great answer.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, you know, I'm working with a couple of clients now, and I'm producing data as evidence, and their response is, wow, I didn't know that we could do that. You know, so again, to go back to Scott's question, I suspect that more organizations are asking for learning development data and analytics because they don't know that we can do it.
Okay, guys, well, we got one more I'm going to get to. We got a bunch of great questions, and when I close out, folks, we're going to address every question. So if we don't get to it live, we will address your question. But this one's from Stacy, and this one's, I love it, and because it's real. And her question, and Kevin, we can start with you, is what if you don't work in a learning culture?
What if you don't work in a learning culture? So I'm just wondering if, go ahead.
If you don't mind, this is David Hughes. I'm going to take a quick stab at it because I think it's very relevant. And so some organizations adopt a culture of learning and development and growth, and some don't. And it's really an uphill battle when there's not a culture of learning. And, you know, I think of the Disneys of the world and the Chick-fil-A's, and there's certain companies we all know of that it's evident that learning is part of their culture and growth and identifying knowledge gaps. But I tell you, the thing I think that I would say to you, Stacy, is, and I want to hear Kevin and Nick chime in, is what we call the crawl, walk, run approach, is getting little nuggets and little tidbits of data that validate and give people the information they need to understand there are gaps and that there is room for improvement, but they're strictly data-driven nuggets, and it's not. And so we've seen some success in that, but it is an uphill battle. So I'll be quiet for a second.
Yeah, I think just to add more to that, one of the best case studies is the state of Tennessee, and the chief learning officer for the state of Tennessee had to change that culture. She has 22 or 2,700 supervisors and untold more types of employees that have different types of job functions, and she had to change that culture from being tenure-based, where it didn't matter what you knew and your skill set, you just kind of knew somebody and you got to the promotion, to adding value to the organization, so it's basically skill-based. And one of the first things that happened for her when she was able to prove the effectiveness of changing the culture into a learning culture was that she eliminated the budget constraints on training. So now she has the budget to do whatever she wants to do for training because she's proven that as a value to the organization. And I don't know if that helps Stacy at all, but you know, there's starting to be a paradigm shift in learning and training in general that's more competency-based, and I think that's more fair and it's good. So change is coming.
And I'd add to that to answer Stacy's question, and I'll answer it in the context of what we're really talking about today, which is measurement, data, and analytics. I believe that when we find ourselves in or working in organizations or consulting with organizations who really don't have a learning culture, data, analytics, and measurement is our opportunities to be ambassadors for change. So one of the ways in which we can drive a culture is by showing them better than we can tell them. And here's what I mean by that. When we can produce data, fact-based evidence, that shows what happens when you deliver learning solutions that changes behavior, that impacts performance, that impacts goals, you can then begin to see the connection between your learning and development efforts and how it impacts the business's bottom line. And so then you ultimately shift toward a learning culture by having the data, by having the fact-based evidence that supports the idea that learning ultimately drives goals. So when I think about it in the context, again, of data and analytics, I believe that what we have the opportunity to do as ambassadors of data and analytics is to move the organization toward a culture of learning by having the evidence backed by data that shows what happens when you do have a culture of learning. Does that make sense, Dave?
That makes total sense. And I think on that note, we're going to close out, because that was really what it's about. It's about moving the needle. It's about impacting the bottom line. And as Stacy alluded to, some of those hills are steeper than others, but you got to start somewhere, and driving it with data-driven and fact-driven information is really a great start. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out, everybody. We're extremely thankful for everybody joining today. You will be receiving a follow-up email with the recording, access to the deck, and any of the tools and resources we mentioned. And again, if we've only scratched the surface, if you have any additional questions or want to follow up, please reach out to us. And I hope everybody has a great remainder of the day, and be safe. Bye-bye.